In my remaining time, I know that we're already pretty deep into this, and I don't want to make a really, really long podcast episode. Want to remind you that this is going to be a series. I will address this topic in the future as well. I also am thinking I'm wanting to return to some written content. I'm probably going to write about this in my blog too. But this is not going to be the only episode where I talk about amillennialism versus dispensationalism or about this book that I'm reading right now. And I'm also going to be reading other books on this topic. Also, expect me to read books from the postmillennial point of view. I'm looking forward to looking into that as well. Even though I'm pretty committed to amillennialism, I have no problem with looking at some of the arguments from postmillennialists and admitting, both in written form on my blog or here on my podcast, hey, here's a passage that I think postmillennialists hold to that is very compelling. Here's another one that I don't, I'm not quite convinced by. Things like that. I have no problem with that. Nor would I be opposed to having a discussion with a brother about postmillennialism. I think that'd be fine. So to get back to amillennialism and a little bit more about what they believe, there's also a big thing that's talked about whenever you have a discussion about eschatology called the last days. This term pops up a lot. To look now, this is back to the text written by Kim Riddlebarger. The phrase latter days appears some 27 times in the New Testament. In several instances, the phrase was used of the end of history, but in most instances, it was used of the eschatological epoch, which began in the New Testament era with the coming of Jesus Christ. From the emphasis the apostolic writers placed on the unity between the Old Testament, which had foretold the Messianic age, and the revelation of the Messiah, it's clear they were conscious that the first advent marked the beginning of the last days and the dawn of the age to come. Throughout the Old Testament, the last days or latter days referred to a future time when Israel would experience unprecedented tribulation, including oppression. We see this in Ezekiel 38:14 to 17, persecution, Daniel 10:14, and also Daniel 11:27, all the way through chapter 12:10. You also have false teaching and apostasy, Daniel 10:14. This horrible tribulation precedes an age of redemption in which Israel will at long last seek the Lord and be delivered. It will also be a time in which all her enemies will be judged. We see this in Hosea 3, verses 4 and 5, Ezekiel 38, verses 14 to 23, Daniel 10:14, Daniel 11:40 to 45, and Daniel 12:1 to 3. According to the Old Testament, this anticipated deliverance and judgment will come to pass through God's Messiah, who will conquer Israel's Gentile enemies and who will establish a Davidic kingdom, his rule extending to the ends of the earth. Genesis 49, 1 through 8, also in Numbers 24:14 to 19, Isaiah 2, verses 2 to 4, Daniel 2, verses 28 to 45, Daniel 10, verses 14 to 21, and Micah 4, 1 through 3. An additional strand of data indicates that the last days include a time of great tribulation and persecution, only to be followed by a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. That's in Daniel 11 and 12. In light of Old Testament pre-Messianic revelation, it is difficult to see how all these divergent themes could possibly be fulfilled by one individual who becomes a valuable point of New Testament polemic against the Jewish concept of Messiah. In light of the coming days of Jesus Christ, the New Testament writers picked up this phrase, latter days, and used it to argue that the last days had arrived and will continue until the final consummation and the end of the age. This means that the Old Testament prophecies of the Great Tribulation, God's deliverance of Israel from her oppressors, God's rule over the Gentiles, and the establishment of his kingdom have been set in motion by Christ's life, death, resurrection, and the formation of the Christian church. As G.K. Beale points out, the resurrection marked the beginning of Christ's messianic reign, while Pentecost was the great sign of Christ's present rule. The Old Testament prophets, however, could not understand how the glorious messianic reign and rule of Christ could coexist side by side with images of persecution and tribulation. So this is a very important thing. I'm going to stop right here. This is Josh talking now. That's important to note. So these people who would say somehow that this Messiah is someone other than Jesus because the Messiah is going to have this glorious messianic reign. Well, that goes all the way back to the New Testament, and meaning especially the Gospels, where all these people thought, well, Jesus is going to come up here as conquering king. Well, as we saw, there is a glorious messianic reign, as the amillennial position points out, simultaneous. It exists side by side with persecution and tribulation. Okay, so there is a millennial, beautiful millennial reign of Jesus Christ happening right now. And yet, there are people in, for example, Iran or China, possibly sections of Ukraine where Zelensky has outlawed certain denominations that are going through terrible repression and persecution, right? So that can happen at the same time. And when Christ's millennial reign began, it was when he was seated at the right hand of the throne of God. You've got many people that died. Peter, head downward. Andrew on an X-shaped cross. Saul then became Paul. Paul died. He was executed by the Romans. And John, although he was not executed, he ended up dying in exile on an island. So all this persecution and terrible, terrible things just happening. And yet it's simultaneously happening with the millennial kingdom of God. To go back to the text, this use of the phrase last days as marking the dawn of the new age of redemption can be seen in Peter's Pentecost sermon, Acts 2, verses 16 and 17. Peter demonstrated that the coming of Christ and his resurrection clearly meant that the last days had arrived. The words "in the last days," I'm going to try to pronounce this, "entais askataisis hermarias," are a translation of the Hebrew words "akari ken," literally afterwards. When Peter quotes these words and applies them to the event which has just occurred, he is saying, in effect, we are in the last days now. Paul used virtually identical language in several places. Galatians 4:4 is one important example. When the time has fully come, God sent his Son. The term Paul used here, translated as fully come, is pleroma, which conveys the thought of fulfillment or completion. In using this term, Paul meant that the coming of Jesus Christ marked the fulfillment of earlier redemptive historical expectations. Paul also said that with the coming of our Lord, the fulfillment of the ages has come. 1 Corinthians 10:11. It is clear that the church is living at the end of the age, since the dawn of the Messianic age eclipsed the former pre-Messianic era. The author of Hebrews made a similar point. But now he, Jesus, has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself, and that is in Hebrews 9:26. The author used the word syntelia, meaning end or completion. As Hokema notes, in the one instance where this word is used with the plural of anoi, or age, it means the present era. The phrase, therefore, is roughly synonymous with Matthew's phrase, the consummation of the ages, or Paul's phrase, the end of ages, or even Peter's phrase, end of the times. The author of Hebrews saw the first coming of Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of the promises of complete, in the sense of once for all, redemption made under the old covenant. The coming of Jesus marked the beginning of the end of the ages. The last days begin with his coming, since Jesus was the long-expected Messiah. This explains the futility of discussing eschatology apart from the person and works of Jesus Christ. So I want to stop here. I think I'm going to stop here because I want to be able to probably write some of this out in written form and then also read it to you guys, and also just talk to you guys in a podcast form more about this in the future. But note what I just read you. I just read you, in many cases, written in Greek or Aramaic. It looks like here that looks like Greek to me. Although to use the Julius Caesar Shakespearean, it was Greek to me means you don't really understand it. So when I read that, though, those are Greek terms saying last, age, right now in different ways. That's one thing that's puzzling about dispensationalists is they'll try and say, well, back in the early, hundreds or the 1000s or the 1500s or the 1800s, that wasn't really the last days, but we are, dadgummit, we are in the last days now. That's something that they will really emphasize a lot. We're in the last days. Jesus is going to come back. The rapture of his church is going to happen any minute now. And it's because we're in the last days. Well, Peter said that too. In a certain language, he didn't say, oh, look forward to the rapture right now. It's about to happen. Or look forward to the reign of Christ. It's about to happen like tomorrow. No, but he said we are in the latter days. They are getting close to the last days. And as far as my timeline, I don't have a timeline of when Christ is going to come back. It could very well be tomorrow. It could be today. It could be the day that you're listening to this 10 years from now, 20 years from now, after I'm long dead. Maybe some of you are listening to this. It could be tomorrow, like, right, back in, forward in 2050, you guys riding in your car or in your flying vehicle or your Uber, whatever it is. I don't know. Maybe everyone's going to get around by Uber in the future. Not sure. You're listening to this and you don't know when Christ is going to come back. No one does. Anyone who tries to tell you, well, I've done a mathematical calculation and I can narrow it down to the day of when Christ is going to come back, that person is a false prophet. Flee from them. Do not listen to them. Because why do I say that? Don't you think that if that person could calculate it out and figure it out, that Jesus would? Jesus is very clear in Matthew. He says, no one knows that day, that hour, not the Son, no one, not even the angels, but the Father only. How do you think a man here on this planet is going to, through some kind of an amazing, mystical or spiritual way, come up with an algorithm or a logarithm or some kind of a mathematical calculation and say, I figured it out. Here's the day. That happened, by the way, at the turn of the century. The guy, I think his last name was Kemp, elderly guy, ended up dying not real long after he did all this, tried to say he calculated exactly when the end of the world was going to be. And he ended up being exposed as a fraud because the day came. Then he tried to say, oh, it's not this day. My math was off. It's this day. The day came and nothing happened. So it's just a crazy, crazy situation. But this is something with dispensationalists where they're like, oh, we're in the last days. And I don't see a compelling case why when you have Peter speaking in Greek saying they're in the latter days, the last days now, whenever he was speaking. That's important to remember. Thank you guys for listening to this episode of The Fog and the Whirlwind, and I will see you at the next one. Remember, there's going to be more videos about this topic. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you for watching this episode of The Fog and the Whirlwind. Go to thefogandthewhirlwind.substack.com to support me financially if you are able. But if you're not able to, you can support me for free by liking this video and commenting on it and sharing it with your friends. The other thing that you can do for me is making sure that you are subscribed on YouTube and follow me on Rumble and on Spotify. Go to Substack, as I've already said, and then follow me on X. It's at Fog and Whirlwind. Thank you, people.